A U.S. official told CNN that the USS George Washington carrier group is headed to the region to replace another carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln. That follows concerns about deteriorating living conditions and worsening mental health among its crew. The Lincoln has spent more than 250 days and counting on its current deployment. One Democratic senator says the vessel set a modern-day record for sailing without a port call. During that time, there were reports of crew members trying to jump overboard and about horrid living conditions on the vessel. Joining me now, retired U.S. Air Force Colonel and CNN military analyst Cedric Leighton. Colonel, a pleasure having you join us to talk about this because I have a suspicion you may have exactly the kind of experience and perspective to help us understand this. So we have these reports, not just of the overboard sailor, but of the conditions on the Lincoln that sailors are dealing with. Shortages of items like soap, not the most hearty of meals, mold in the showers, et cetera, that I think would make even a short stint at sea unpleasant, right? Much less 250 plus days. And that's not to mention the actual job that these service members are tasked with focusing on. Give us an idea of the impacts of these conditions and if there is such a thing as a deployment being too long.
Yeah, Brian, it's great to be with you. Well, there's so many aspects to this. I had the honor of serving with the Navy for a deployment at sea during my career, and I spent just 30 days. So if you can imagine 250 days versus 30 days, I definitely feel for the sailors. But during that time, we also had plumbing issues. We had, water that, flooded out the toilets, and there was also an issue with the showers. So the conditions were not pleasant. They were definitely not what is being reported, for the USS Abraham Lincoln. But it definitely was something that impacted the quality of the deployment and really the ability to carry out your job in very confined quarters and with limited access to communications capabilities and the types of things we kind of take for granted in everyday life. But it was definitely an experience of a lifetime. But it was also an experience where there were certain hardships that you may not take into account if you're not used to deployments at sea.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Colonel, addressing some of these reports while talking to reporters in Panama. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Completely misrepresented. Listen, we make sure that every ship, every crew, every captain has everything we can provide them at every single moment. Some deployments are longer than others, and I have more respect and gratitude for those sailors than anybody.
All right, so a couple of things to unpack there. One, him saying everything that can be provided is provided. That's not the same as saying we give them everything they need. And two, it's well documented at this point that Secretary Hegseth has been pushing for this warrior culture. Is that a culture that allows for service members to actually admit when they've reached a breaking point where it doesn't have to get filtered through family members?
Yeah, so that taking the second part first, I would say that the warrior culture ethos that Secretary Hegseth is trying to impart on the Department of Defense, that may conflict with the idea that the services that the Navy provides or that other services, military services provide to their members are really there to protect them both psychologically as well as physically. So one of the key things to remember in any type of deployment, whether it's with the Navy or the Army or the Air Force or the Marine Corps or the Space Force, it really is based on the ability of the people to protect each other. You fight for your buddy, basically. You fight for the guy next to you in the foxhole is the kind of the old adage here. And the ability of teams to work together becomes a paramount thing when it comes to these kinds of deployments, because you really have to depend on each other when you're out at sea or when you're in a remote location. And that's basically what you're dealing with here. The Navy has a unique culture. It has unique traditions. The warrior ethos that Secretary Hegseth talks about, there's a certain tough guy image associated with that. The issue, though, is this: even tough guys need help. and the ability of people to get help, no matter what their gender, no matter what their situation, is really something that the modern military has gotten much better at. You saw like the service or therapy dog that Pamela Brown had in her report on the Lincoln. That's the kind of thing that's a more modern, more innovative approach. And that is really more in keeping with the kind of warrior culture that you want to instill. You want to instill a culture of teamwork. And frankly, the wars of the present and the wars of the future are going to be ones in which the mental ability and the mental and psychological health of the people involved is going to be much more important than almost any other factor in the ability of the unit to become a cohesive whole. And that's what you want. You want a cohesive whole that can carry out the mission.
And Colonel, we have just about a minute left. So this other carrier group, the USS George Washington, is on its way to the Middle East to relieve the Lincoln. A U.S. official has said this was pre-planned before these reports. But the length of the time the Lincoln's been at sea without a port call, setting that modern-day record, according to Senator Blumenthal, one of the lawmakers wanting some answers. What could those lawmakers actually accomplish here in this moment, if anything, by asking questions about this deployment, especially knowing that change is already on the way with this new carrier?
Yeah, so what they really should be looking at is the kinds of lessons learned that we can take from this. For example, you don't want food to run out. You don't want sailors on board a ship like the Lincoln to have issues getting fruits and vegetables. Back in the age of exploration, you had the issue of scurvy, and that kind of vitamin deficiency disease is something that really had an impact on sailors at that time in history, and you don't want to repeat those kinds of things. We are supposed to be much more forward-thinking when it comes to deployments and the ability of us to maintain our health in remote environments, and that is really something that they should look at. The supply efforts, the ability of ships like this to actually make port calls to kind of normalize the routine. All of those things become important, and those are the types of questions that the senators and congressmen should be asking about.
Joining me now from Honolulu, Hawaii, is retired U.S. Navy Captain Carl Schuster. He's the former Director of Operations at the U.S. Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center Pacific. Captain, great to see you. You are a veteran with decades in the Navy. What's your initial reaction when you hear that any ship has been at sea for more than 250 days?
I think it's exceptionally difficult for the crew. I never did more than 90 days at sea, and I can tell you the minute you pass the 60-day mark, you're feeling tired of the deployment. It's not unusual. Certainly in my day, we had one or two guys try to jump overboard at about the 50 to 60-day mark. Being at sea on a carrier, particularly in a stressful conflict situation, it's very intense. It places a very heavy psychological stress on you and physical, particularly for the guys in the propulsion spaces and the guys on the flight deck. Their work is very intense, very hard, and very stressful, and life, in some cases, very dangerous. And everyone eventually reaches a breaking point. So we shouldn't condemn these guys. We should thank them for their service and give them all the help we can to get through the stress and situations they felt. I'm glad to hear a carrier is going out there to replace the Abe. In a perfect world, I would have sent her about 90 days earlier, but we have requirements these days exceed the number of carriers that we have. And so the human element of the Navy is paying for those decisions from a decade ago. Also, there are no good ports to visit in that area. You can't go into Djibouti. It's a good place, but it's within drone and missile range of the Houthis. You can't pull into Dubai because you're within drone and missile range of the Iranians. So the nearest safe port is Mumbai. And while I've never been there, I've heard good things about it, but it's about 4 days steaming away and 4 days to come back. So we face difficult choices, and the crew is paying the price for that. I think it'll be glad to have them go home, and it'll be great to see them replaced and get some relief, if you will.
It's a good point. You mentioned Dubai. I've literally seen and been on board a U.S. aircraft carrier that made a port visit there in the past, and clearly within range of the Iranian drones and missiles. But I want to ask about these most frightening reports that you mentioned that you have seen and heard of suicide attempts in decades past, where service personnel try to throw themselves overboard. What are the realities of mental health in the Navy, and particularly aboard ships where sailors and Marines are far from their families for months and months and months at a time?
It's particularly stressful. And in my day, we were somewhat lucky in a way, in that we grew up in a society where you were surrounded by friends and shipmates. So you were accustomed to having almost a social network around you. Today's young people are more isolated psychologically. And so that natural support network doesn't exist, or it's not as great. We have chaplains, we have senior enlisted people and mid-level enlisted people who track these guys, talk to them. But let's face it, 200 days is a period longer than that we've seen since World War II. In my day, a 68-day deployment, 68 days continuously at sea was considered stressful. We had a couple of ships do 90, but we never had anyone do 200. And if you're down in the propulsion spaces, working 12, 14 hours a day, you don't see the sun. And so you're very dependent on your relationship with those around you, your interactions, and you increasingly feel isolated. So even minor things become a major issue over time. And as I said, each of us reaches a saturation or breaking point at some time. The handful of sailors that this has happened to, clearly it reached their breaking point. In my view, we ought to rotate people off every 90 days or so. If you can't remove the ship, then maybe find people to put on the ship to replace those you take off and send somewhere to kind of decompress, if you will. Of course, that's logistically complicated and expensive, but you don't have enough ships, then you need to think of how you take care of the human element of those ships.